Okay, so last time we took a look at how the connection, the orders of connection were ultimately lost in the West, and therefore that meaning, the meaning that is captured by those orders of connection, came into crisis. We started with Aquinas having to deal with the rediscovery in Europe of Aristotelian science. And we noted that what Aquinas did was, I mean, he did a lot of brilliant things, but what he did was he reconfigured the two-world model that he inherited from the Axial Revolution, but he did something different. He said that science studied this world and revelation didn't study, but provided knowledge for the upper world. The upper world was supernatural, the lower world was natural. But what becomes very important are two things, right? This world is no longer the illusory world. It's a real world of which we can have real knowledge, and that real knowledge is generated rationally. The other world is also real, but its knowledge is generated non-rationally. In fact, it's generated through will rather than reason. And so what started to happen is, right, spirituality gets separated from reason and gets situated within will. And what also starts to happen is this world becomes something that is in itself intrinsically real and can be studied rationally and ultimately scientifically. That was, as we've seen, going to put tremendous pressure on the axial structure that had been inherited from ancient Israel and ancient Greece. And then lots of events conspired with what Aquinas had done to put tremendous pressure on that framework. And we talked about what was happening, especially with the bubonic plague and with the civil war in the church and the 100 Years' War and the war against the Cathars and all of this stuff to basically seriously undermine the sense of order that people had and to elevate their own efforts, their own self-determination and their faculty of will and the need to use that will to impose an order on an increasingly chaotic world. That, of course, lined up nicely with Aquinas' emphasis on God's will. And that was taken up in a new form of spirituality, the Rhineland mystics, who emphasized God's will and emphasized understanding love, not the way Augustine had done in its interrelation with reason, but understood love in its connections with will, and that what love was the will sort of negating itself, right, turning against itself to open up a space so that God's will was no longer impeded. So it was no longer the rational mystical ascent up. Instead, it was this, right, making a space within so that God would come in. And so spirituality now became primarily around, or oriented around ideas of will, the self, sort of locked against itself, and ideas of emptiness and conflict. Occam took a lot of this spirituality and then gave it a philosophical understanding by proposing that God's will was not in any way bound by his reason, and that therefore, right, there is no rational assent to God at all. And just like God, we impose order on the world through how we're using language. And a lot of the order, a lot of the relations and patterns that we think exist in the world are actually only imposed on it by language. What starts to happen is the world seems to be, again, more and more the product of our cognitive appraisal of it. And God is becoming progressively more and more absurd because he's acting just in an arbitrarily, that means not bound by reason, purely willful fashion. We then talked about the rise of commercialism and how that afforded new psychotechnologies coming in to the West, importantly Hindu-Arabic numerals, integers, and algebra. All of this afforded new math. A tremendous pressure was put on the observation of the heavens to improve celestial navigation. And so you had a gathering of much more data, much more powerful math being applied to it. And then this revealed that the heavens were not behaving in the orderly fashion that Aristotle had said. And that was happening in the scientific realm. Over back in the economic realm, commercialism was affording the rise of corporation, banks, contracts, the state, right? That was completely separate from the religious worldview we've been talking about. Back to the science, Copernicus comes along and argues that the math will be better if you put the sun at the center of the solar system. And this is a radical idea. He basically divorces the mind from the world, severs it. The mind is now trapped behind a veil of illusion, a veil of appearances. The only thing that cuts through to reality is math. And what that simultaneously does is, right, render all of our experience illusory in some sense, not connected to reality. Galileo picked up on what was happening, the idea of math as the language of the universe. And he did a couple things with that. He integrated it with a new experimental method. He used math in a much more abstract way in order to do that. And what he discovered was inertial motion, which sort of killed the universe, killed purpose in the universe. Came up with the idea of actual matter, which destroyed the form-matter distinction and undermined the whole normative order. He also made a distinction between the primary and secondary qualities, and so all of the things that we think make our life meaningful, including meaning, don't exist in the world because they're non-mathematical. They only exist in the mind. And the only thing what we really have was scientific method, which itself was born from the realization how much the mind was willfully biasing and imposing an order on things that didn't exist in things. And the scientific method was a psychotechnology specifically designed for creating that. Back within the religious sphere, Luther, who was influenced by the Rhineland mystics and what had been happening in theology because of people like Occam, very much internalized all of this and came up with the idea that the self, and he was influenced by Paul and Augustine, the self was radically folded into itself, radically obsessed with itself, and also radically hating itself. So the inner conflict becomes the defining feature of the self and its incapacity for self-transcendence, because God has now become pure will, and he saves people in a purely willful, purely arbitrary fashion, not based in any rational way on anything they do. So that any attempts at self-transcendence are pride and sin and should be treated as such. So Lutheranism, trains people to have an inner sense of unworthiness, emptiness, and to continually look for unearned external validation, which is precisely the psychological structure of narcissism. So there's the training for narcissism. There's also the shutting down of all the wisdom institutions, the monasteries, for example, because all such pursuits in Lutheran terms were an example of people trying to achieve self-transcendence, which was absolutely impossible. We did talk about the positive benefits, or however you want to, whatever the correct adjective is. I think democracy is a positive benefit, and one of the things that comes out of this is an attack on tradition and the hierarchy of the church, and the church gets run democratically, but only the church for Luther, not the external world, which is still under conflict and the rule of will, rather than the inner world inside the church, which is run by love, the world of the people that have been saved. But that also affords the separation of church and state, which we now enjoy as well. Whether or not the next one is a benefit depends on your particular political, economic philosophy, but this form of Protestantism also drove capitalism and was a very powerful motivator for capitalist success without a lot of conspicuous consumption. By this time, by the time of Shakespeare, God is withdrawing very significantly from Western society. Okay, because he's become progressively reduced to an absurd force of will that acts in an arbitrary and anxiety-producing manner. Descartes tries to answer all of this, and he creates a new psychotechnology, Cartesian graphing, in order to try and do it. And he comes up with the idea of cognition as computation, and that is the way in which we could get certainty and reconnect back to reality. But unfortunately, it doesn't go the way I think Descartes intended it to go, unfortunately for Descartes. Hobbes points out that if Descartes is right, then we are cognitive just because we're computers, and we can have purely material computers. There's no need for the idea of a soul or anything immortal like that. Descartes does respond to Hobbes, and he offers aspects of the mind that can't be explained by Hobbes because of the scientific revolution. But we noted that that explanation, which allows Descartes to win, right, wins in a very Pyrrhic way, because Descartes' vision, his framework, basically radically disconnects mind from body, mind from mind, mind from the world, and even the mind from itself. So that what used to be the contact with reality between the mind and the world in Aristotle has shrunk in Descartes to this little moment of consciousness where the mind touches itself. And so we have three things interwoven together. We have the Cartesian connection collapse. All of the orders have been undermined, and we get these radical gaps and disconnections. That is interacting with, right, the restless narcissistic self that has emerged out of the Protestant Reformation and all of the anxiety that had been preceding it, back to the Rhineland mystics, etc. And the sapiential obsolescence, the closing down of the monasteries, the separation of the university from the monastery, and the separation of the knowledge project from the wisdom project. And so what happens is the three orders by this time, the three orders that connect us in the way we need to be connected in order to deal with delusion and self-deception and afford self-transcendence and flourishing, have all been deeply undermined and put into question. And that's where we got to. Is that correct? Any questions about that? Okay. So, yes?
Just really quick, sapiential obsolescence is when the collapse of wisdom institutions.
Yeah, I mean, they're literal shutting down, a lot of them. So the institutions are shut down. The tradition, the long tradition of spiritual exercises to afford, as St. Bonaventure would put it, the journey of the mind to God, all of that is now gone, at least in the Protestant world. But because the Protestant world is the world that becomes increasingly more directly associated with capitalism and with science and technology, that world is going to become increasingly more dominant. Okay, so I will upload tonight or tomorrow the monograph that is, you'll get it in its penultimate form on the thing I'm going to talk about now, which is the zombie zeitgeist as a cultural expression in mythological imagery of the meaning crisis. There's a short video on YouTube by me called Why Are Zombies So Big Right Now?, which is one of my more popular videos. So you can take a look at that too, and the monograph will be available. Let me be very clear. I am not putting the monograph there for you to cause you any anxiety. I'm not expecting you to master it, remember it, memorize it, or anything. It is there in a purely helpful manner, okay? You could completely not read it, that's fine, before the test, and I guarantee you that will not impact on your performance. It is there so that you can read it before the test if you wish, you can read it after. It's there to supplement this lecture, but I'm not putting an extra demand on you. That would be unfair. Do you understand my intent then, everybody? Okay, it is there for your use as you see fit. Okay? What I talk about in lecture, of course, I do expect you to know. Okay, but that's fine. Okay, so first of all, Zeitgeist is a German term that means the spirit of the times. When you see these large patterns taking over in a culture. And as I said, if you want, I will just present the core idea here, but if you want to take a look at the argument in depth, the monograph will be available for you. What is really interesting is we have first the symbol of the zombie, and then increasingly that has been conjoined to another mythological symbol that has been prevalent in the West, the apocalypse, and then the two have come together in the zombie apocalypse. And now I cannot go through a week of my life without hearing people utter that phrase, the zombie apocalypse, which is very startling. Just to give it a little bit of context, in 2008, a review was published. There had been about 600 zombie movies made since 1920. So people have been making zombie movies. White Zombie was one of the first way back in 1932. Very different movie than the zombies of today. So there's been about 600 movies. One half of them have been made in the last 10 years. So one of the things that's in the monograph is you can also track the use of the word zombie, and it has been spiking in the last 10 years. And there's an increasing number of TV shows of varying degrees of quality. There are things that border on ritual enactments called zombie walks, in which people don the attire of a zombie and then walk around like zombies. Very interesting and weird form of participation magic. My girlfriend's brother was he, or I can't remember, if it was him or someone else, was telling me a story of he was in a zombie walk. No, it was a friend of mine. Sorry, I'm mistaken attribution. He was telling me about he was in an emergency situation and it was the middle of a zombie walk, and the doctor was trying to get the cooperation of the people around him, and he would say like, okay, can you stop? This person needs your help, and the person would only respond as a zombie. And the doctor kept saying, no, I get that you're trying to act like a zombie, but this is the real world. This person needs help. Like, can you call 911? And the person would not come out of character. It was like the commitment to this role was astonishing. So, what's going on there? Why this massive fascination? Books, TVs, movies, becoming a pervasive feature in video games. We are drenching ourselves with this symbol, right? Which would seem very odd, since on the surface it's a very unattractive symbol, right? One of the defining features of a zombie is literally decadent and therefore literally grotesquely ugly. So what's going on there? And then why increasingly, because this isn't original to the zombie trope, why increasingly is the zombie associated with apocalypse? So that the zombie's existence is coextensive with an apocalypse, with the ending of civilization in some important way. And why all this weird inversion of Christian symbolism? Zombies are a perversion of the Christian resurrection, right? They come back to life, but they come back soulless, rather than what you do in Christianity, you come back glorified, right? The apocalypse in the Bible is supposed to reveal God's ultimate purpose and meaning behind things. It's supposed to be where we finally say, oh, that's why all of that happened. That's what the apocalypse actually means, revelation, the final revealing. But instead, with the zombie apocalypse, there is no final revelation. In fact, the world drifts into meaninglessness. So why this fascination? Why is it being integrated with Apocalypse? And why does it have all of this weird twisting of central Christian ideas? Well, one of the things I think is that zombies, and there have been several analyses of what the zombie represents. Some people have talked about how it represents how we're increasingly surrounded by strangers. That's true, but that's not going to be good enough because we have been increasingly surrounded by strangers since civilization. Because that's one of the defining features of civilization. We live with strangers rather than kinship groups. So that's not too persuasive of an argument. Some people have talked about the zombie representing an increasingly kind of consumatory capitalism. I think that's right, but it misses out why the zombie has a lot of the features that the zombie has. For example, why all this twisting and perversion of Christian symbolism if all you want to do is represent rapacious capitalism? Okay, so I have a thesis I'd like to advance that Philip and Chris and I are working on together, which is, I think, not to exclude these other aspects, because almost all cultural symbols are multivalent, they have multiple functions, but I would argue that the central function, the central mythological representation that the zombies are doing is as representations of the meaning crisis. Okay. So think about some of the central features of the zombie. First of all, as I said, the zombie is an explicit perversion of classic Christian symbolism, which means it represents, some kind of recognition of the collapse, the inversion, the degradation of the Christian framework. Some shows even pick up on this explicitly. So there's several episodes in a current Netflix thing called Z Nation. I watch a lot of these zombie things. Some of it because I want to, for entertainment, some of it because of this project. And that's a bit of a sacrifice on my part. Okay? But there's a couple of explicit episodes where it's made clear that the zombies represent a perversion of the Christian idea of resurrection, the Christian idea of the apocalypse in which evil is destroyed, good prevails, and the ultimate meaning and purpose of things are revealed. So I think that's a pretty good place to begin. But look at some of the features of the zombie themselves. Zombies don't talk. They don't possess intelligence. They, in fact, have lost one of the defining features of our capacity for meaning making. So they represent almost a complete loss, right, of meaning making. But not a complete loss. They are reduced to a weird perversion. They don't even have animal meaning. Because you may say, well, their drive, they have a drive for consumption. But it is not meaningful for them because they do not consume the way living things do in order to live and grow. There are many instances of this made clear to people. One of the most famous ones is a scene, I can't remember if it's in one of the Romero films or in The Walking Dead, where there's only the upper half of the zombie still in existence. And the zombie is eating, and the food is just falling through, like the zombie, and it doesn't do anything. And that's why the food is not part of the way in which the zombie survives, and it doesn't satiate the zombie. So it's just become, even at the level of consumption, it has become meaningless. It has become even separated from, biological meaning. That's how complete that degradation is. Now, interestingly, in many, not all, but in many incarnations of the zombie, they hunger for brains, which is a bizarre thing. They hunger for brains, right? Because they seem to be hungering for the organ that generates what? Meaning. Okay? It's a bizarre thing for them to hunger for. But it is a common trope in many incarnations of the zombie that their abiding consumptive hunger is actually for the organ represented that represents the very thing they lack almost completely, which is intelligibility and meaning-making capacity. Right? Zombies represent a perversion of culture. They're one of the few communal monsters. They hang out in large, increasingly large numbers. But it is not a culture, it is not a society. They drift aimlessly, purposelessly. There's no history, there's no structure, right? So it's not a culture in any way. And their very motion as a group is itself drifting. They drift. Right? They're not organized or cooperating in any way whatsoever. Unlike many of the classic monsters in horror, zombies are homeless. Dracula has his castle, and the werewolf has its lair, the ghost has its haunted house. Zombies are homeless. They don't belong anywhere. There isn't anywhere that they're trying to get to. Yes?
Do they represent evil? Yes.
Pardon me?
Do they represent evil?
No. That's an important point. So let's move to it. They're not evil. Okay? Evil implies an intentional act, right? They're less than living things. There's no evil. They don't represent any supernatural force, principle, any plan, any goal. They're not evil. Right? That's why there's nothing satisfying about, other than in a visceral sense, and I meant that literally, by the way, about killing a zombie. It doesn't resolve anything. It doesn't show or establish some moral principle. Yes?
Don't they represent wiping out humanity?
They represent the wiping out of humanity, but is that evil? Is that what evil means? So, is a hurricane evil?
What is their gift?
No, please answer my question first. Is a hurricane evil?
Okay.
It wipes out large numbers of human beings. What does the hurricane lack that it would need to have in order to be evil? Right, and zombies don't have that. Okay. Now, what better symbol for the decadence of Western civilization than a bunch of human beings who won't die, but are perennially and permanently decaying? They're also ugly. They represent the loss of the cosmos. Not only are they meaningless, they represent a loss of beauty. Importantly, connected with what I was just saying a few minutes ago about them not being evil, they're not supernatural in any way. They're just us. And the way you become a zombie is by connecting with it. They represent the antithesis of connection. They consume or they infect. There is no way to connect to a zombie. They represent the antithesis. All they do is infect or consume. It's interesting how often, in fact, right, the zombie is even nameless to the people watching, to people we're watching in these shows. Almost all, there are a couple of exceptions, right, and they're kind of interesting exceptions too. One of the things that people don't know about in these movies are zombies, to the point that they will often not even call them zombies, like they're called the Walking Dead in the show by the same name, right? Now why? Well, it seems to me because there isn't sort of any narrative attached to them that is facilitated by naming them. Look, here's a standard horror movie. Nobody believes in vampires. Nobody believes in vampires. People are getting killed by what appear to be vampires. Eventually, people admit, oh, it's a vampire. And then they get the knowledge that they refuse to use about how you deal with vampires. They get out the holy, the crosses and the holy water and the stake, and then they kill the vampire. So that's sort of the trope. But if you find out it's a zombie, what does that do for you? Well, shoot its head. Okay, great. Because the issue isn't about killing a particular zombie. Right? You're worn down by just constant attrition and the lack of an ability to build an alternative structure of things. You can't build a new world. That's why you get a lot of tropes in the zombie movies that people try to build some structure, try to make some civilization, and what happens is it collapses from within, and then the zombies get in. Now, why is it now increasingly connected to the idea of apocalypse? Well, as I said, apocalypse was born from the Israelite and Christian idea of a fundamental culmination to time. Remember, stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the end has to be some kind of resolution of the central problem that the narrative posed and addressed. And in the Christian worldview, which came out of one branch of the ancient Israelites, and I think you can make a very good argument that this was deeply influenced by Persian ideas coming out of Zoroastrianism, because that's where you get the first clear ideas of a final judgment, right, of all of history. So the idea is the culmination, there'll be this final judgment, evil will be finally and completely defeated, good will triumph, and what will happen is there'll be the final revelation of the true world. People will be taken into the true world. The meaning and purpose of our existence will be revealed to us, etc. So the apocalypse is initially a really wonderful, it's a happy ending, but it goes through this very dark thing, because the old world, the world that is the world in which we're trapped, right? The world of illusion and suffering has to be broken, like the square in the 9-dot problem. It has to be broken and smashed so that a new order can finally be revealed. What happens is the second part of the apocalypse starts to withdraw as God starts to withdraw. And what happens is you start to get secular versions of the apocalypse appearing. Probably one of the first, right, it's very clear, it's not completely secular, is The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells in the late 19th century. So this is where the Martians invade. There's been two movies, a pretty good one in the 1950s, and then I don't know how to evaluate the Tom Cruise one, because I don't know how to evaluate Tom Cruise. He's kind of a black hole of intelligibility for me. Right, and what's interesting, if you go back, the Martians invade, they have superior technology, and what that represents is it represents, right, the first kind of secular apocalypse, the idea that our technology will get away from us in some important way, and will be attacked by strange beings who possess the superior technology. In the end of the story, the Martians are killed by microbes, and this is seen as a sign of God's providence. So although it's largely secular, God comes in at the end, and he sort of, so we had, it's a very, I find it kind of, that H.G. Wells made this argument. So the millennia of suffering and disease was all part of God's plan to protect us from the Martians. I think I could have done better, but okay. What increasingly happens, though, is the apocalypse starts to lose any of that religious thing. So you get the fear of the nuclear apocalypse or the alien invasion through the 50s, the 60s, obviously representing the Cold War. And then what starts to happen is that metaphor of sort of nuclear annihilation and the zombies start to come together. It's like they're seeking each other, right? So the zombies represent us losing our ability to make meaning, and the apocalypse represents all meaning being drained out of the world. So you've got the agents and their world both losing meaning and coming together in the zombie apocalypse. And that sort of starts to happen. There's the first of the Romero movies sort of indicates that the zombies might have been caused by nuclear contamination. It gets picked up in a movie from the 70s starring Charlton Heston called The Omega Man, which is a remake. It's a movie based on the I Am Legend story by Richard Matheson. And there, the nuclear apocalypse is linked to a bunch of creatures that are are very close to being zombies. And then it just goes like that. And then they stay together and they get permanently wed together. So that now zombies are always presented in a situation of apocalypse. And it's very hard to represent apocalypse without having something like zombies running around. Okay. Again, why? Because they're the two sides of the collapse of the worldview. Right? We have disappeared as, agents of meaning, and the world has disappeared as a meaningful place for us. The zombie apocalypse. It is persistent, it is pervasive, and it is very powerful in our culture. And I think the main reasons for this, and like I said, there's a lot more argument around this. The main reason for this is that the culture is struggling to articulate to itself, in some initial phase, in some initial form, this crisis, the meaning crisis. There's also some connections between the meaning crisis and other crises that are looming. We all have a sense of impending economic danger, very clear and profound sense of ecological destruction, which of course the zombie also picks up on, zombie apocalypse especially. So very often cultures represent main things happening initially in this kind of mythogrammic way where you create a series of images and tropic stories around them in order to try and articulate and hold in mind certain fears, certain concerns, often in an exaggerated form, so that they can be communicated effectively between people. So that's my main argument. The main argument is that the zombie zeitgeist is evidence that the culture is becoming at least imaginatively and metaphorically aware of the meaning crisis and how pervasive it's becoming. So this crisis is associated with other things that are rising. Oh, I see your hand. Right? So worldwide suicide rates are accelerating, things like that. Mental health crisis, often wrapped up with issues about meaning. So I'm not going to go into all this detail. Like I said, some of those things can be explored if you want in more detail through the monograph and some of the other essays we cite in the monograph if you want to read them as well. All I want is to establish to you that the meaning crisis is now, in some sense, coming home to roost for us. We are more and more, just like we represented the Cold War mythologically with the alien invasions or the nuclear apocalypse. We now seem to be representing a crisis again in mythological narrative fashion. Yes?
When would you put a date on the meaning crisis and when it started and all the way back to Luke?
Yes. I don't think it has a particular time it starts. Like most things historical, it's an ongoing developmental process. I think what's happening, though, is it's been accelerating in the last half of the 20th century. Again, I can't go into this great detail. Here's the main argument why I think it's now accelerating. There was an attempt, there have been several attempts to deal with the meaning crisis by creating secular alternatives to the lost Christian Greek world orders, right? So many of these make use of central ideas drawn from that long axial tradition, but in an attempt to wed it to a secular scientific worldview. And the 20th century, I would say, even the 19th century, I think Romanticism was largely about that, but I'm not going to go into Romanticism right now. Many of you have seen some talks in which I discussed my criticisms of Romanticism and its idea that, you know, the world is a blank slate that we impose meaning on through our artistic endeavors, things like that, which is really symptomatic of the meaning crisis. But these pseudo-religious ideologies I'm talking about are things like Nazism and Marxism. Marxism, right, attempts to integrate, you know, this narrative idea to history with a very strong sort of normative order we are progressing towards utopia, and it claims to have a nomological basis that has a scientific explanation for history and economics, and it offers, right, a comprehensive replacement for what was lost in the meaning crisis. The problem is that it's not clear that it actually afforded the things that it promised, and it drenched a lot of the earth in human blood. Opposed to it was another mythological pseudo-religious ideology that I've already talked to you about, tried to capitalize on some extreme versions of the axial world. The Gnosticism found within Nazism, and the appeal of a lot of mythological, very decadent axial principles in a secular religion that was designed again to address the meaning crisis, which had been particularly exacerbated in Germany after the First World War because of the loss of empire and the loss of the war, humiliation, etc. These two great pseudo-religious ideologies, thankfully for the rest of the world, decided to battle each other in the Second World War in a titanic level that has not been matched by anything since. The German invasion of Russia culminates in the Battle of Kursk in 1943, deep inside Russia. Over 3 million men involved, 7,000 tanks. It goes horizon to horizon. It is literally the largest battle ever fought in history. What came out of it was, right, ultimately the collapse of both of these pseudo-religious ideologies. We had what looked like a potential replacement, America and the American dream, and that there was a secular version of the manifest destiny, and everyone was destined to be rich, and social mobility would be the normative order, and how you ascended towards the real world, etc. That has now increasingly also come into question because of its increasing series of failures to deliver on its central promises. And we see, I would argue, America getting increasingly desperate about trying to keep the American dream alive, even though all the evidence is pointing very clearly to a country that is losing its educational base, losing its social mobility, right, losing its basic health care, etc., etc. So, my answer to you is, I think it has started a long time ago, but I think it accelerates at the end of the 20th century because of the collapse of these pseudo-religious ideologies that attempted to co-opt a lot of the structure that we found, right, in, you know, the Christian Greek framework, but failed spectacularly because of the bloodshed, the suffering that they caused, rather than the utopia they promised. In fact, one way of thinking about the meaning crisis, and I've argued this, in the positive sense of having an argument discussion with Dan Dolderman in public, was what we face is that we seem to face a huge set of crises, the ecological crisis being a pertinent one, in which we sort of know what needs to be done and we're incapable of doing it. And what seems to be going on is, as I've suggested to you before, because the meaning crisis really limits people's ability to pursue, right, self-transcending, self-sacrificing kinds of behavior. Right? When meaning is lacking, people, right, hold on to whatever they have. Whereas people will relinquish their hold on things if you promise them meaning. That was in fact exactly how Nazism and communism had such tremendous success. But we seem incapable. We need something like a religion to bring about a transformation, right, in human cognition and consciousness and culture that only religions have been able to do. And yet, secular versions of religion have proved to be nightmares. And so we're trapped between, we can't go back, and it doesn't look like we can go forward. That's another sense, I think, of why the meaning crisis is accelerating. So those are my 4 sort of points as to why it accelerates now. So thank you for asking me a question. So, the zombie zeitgeist, the increasing acceleration of the meaning crisis, the increasing sense of terror that it is inflicting, or horror at least, that is inflicting upon us. In fact, I would use the word horror rather than terror. Horror has a specific aesthetic to it. Horror is different from intense fear. So most horror movies are not horror movies. They're what I like to call startle and puncture movies. They're designed to startle you with some creature that is going to puncture somebody else. Bite it or stab it or rip it. Right? And, you know, and so what you do is you get people into very vulnerable states, and then they suddenly get attacked, which is basically just a revamped version of a very ancient fear we have of predation, right? Which is, I mean, that's, I guess, I don't find them amusing, those movies. They don't move me, I just sort of sit there. Like, yeah, that's a predator killing a human being, yeah. Now, horror movies are different, right? Horror movies generally horror represents a realization of your loss of a loss of your grip on reality. So in a horror movie, what's happened is your ability to make sense of things is seriously undermined. A classic example of that for me, and I'm not saying it works this way for everybody, was the movie The Shining, which was Stanley Kubrick's venture into horror. And I was watching this movie, and you know, I sort of get it. I'm a fairly educated guy and stuff like that. So I'm watching this movie and I go, oh, right, so this is Stephen King. He's going mad, and this is a metaphor for alcoholism. And I know that Stephen King is really angry about alcoholism, and so the Jack Nicholson character, just, you know, that reference. Oh, and I started sort of patting myself on the back and congratulating myself for, you know, totally understanding the movie. Because, you know, he's going insane and blah, blah, blah. And then there's a scene where he gets locked from the outside inside a pantry. He can't get out because he's locked from the outside. And I remember sort of getting disconcerted and thinking, well, what's going to happen? She's going to let him out. She's going to do something stupid and let him out, because, like, how else is the movie going to go on? And he's talking to the voices in his head, and I'm thinking, yeah, so what? And then there's this moment when they say, okay, and then the voices open the door, and the door opens. And a chill went down my spine. Because I thought I had understood the movie, and I didn't. And it was like, oh no, there's this other thing happening. And that's horror. And I think what I'm trying to say is zombies don't represent so much fear because they don't really startle you so much. It's more a kind of horror. Everything is being lost. Our grip on things is literally being chewed away, ground down. The slowness of most zombies. There's a few movies where they're fast. But the slowness of the zombie, I think, is actually an important aspect of the zombie. It's not the startle and puncture movies rely on. It's the grinding away like you would have if you were slowly realizing that you were losing your sanity. You were slowly losing your grip. That your intelligibility and your mind was slowly decaying away. And I can only imagine what that horror must actually be like for the people in the initial stages of dementia or Alzheimer's. That's the kind of thing I think the zombie represents. Horror, not terror. All right, so this has gotten kind of bleak, right? What I've tried to do is give you, through this history and through this mythology, understood in, right, not in false stories that no, look, mythology isn't primarily about, things in the deep past that never happened. Mythology is about perennial patterns that keep reoccurring. Yes?
Would you say this is like the same as, this is a lot of like movies also coming up with like disease, like people dying of disease.
Pardon me?
There's a lot of movies also people dying of disease. So
Disease,
apocalypse,
yeah.
Like, would you say it's pretty much the same?
Yeah, it's a very similar idea.
Because if you see like the way like most movies and like movies are kind of different, it's like what like you said, it's like the source. Like you don't really know what the source is, so people kind of turn intrinsically and blame themselves for
That's
not
right.
seeing it coming.
What happens is people undermine the very fabric of culture rather than, right, tracking down the monster and killing it. Yeah, very much. And very much like we are the problem in the zombie movies or the disease movies. We are the problem. I mean, they even say that in a couple of places. There's 2 different episodes, I believe, at least one for sure, in The Walking Dead, where they will actually explicitly say that. The survivors, the crew, Rick and Daryl, all that, they'll say something like, we are the Walking Dead. They will refer to themselves as the Walking Dead. Trying to tell the audience, right, that the human beings, right, have become so decayed that they're not significantly different from the zombies. Okay, so try to show you through this history and mythology, in the sense of mythology that I've just explained to you, right? The meaning crisis. And this has given us some insight into meaning, but we need the other thing. We need, right, the cognitive science of this meaning making itself, right? So, right, by putting together this history, the history and mythology, and the cognitive science, we can get a better understanding, a deeper understanding, again, of what this meaning is, and perhaps also, by taking a look at the changes going on within cognitive science, we can come to some appraisal of opportunities being afforded by the 3rd generation in cognitive science for responding to the meaning crisis. But of course, part of the course will be that cognitive science on its own isn't going to be able to do that. We're going to need, part of the argument is going to be that what seems to be needed is a reconnection of what was lost a long time ago. The scientific knowledge enterprise of cognitive science needs to be reconnected with a sapiential project of wisdom cultivation. The 2 that we used to have together in the West and have been severed. So cognitive science on its own comes out of a long history of the independent university. We need something that still has connections to the monastic tradition of wisdom cultivation. And so you can see what part of the argument is going to be. Buddhism is going to take that role. And Buddhism can take that role precisely because, as I've argued already, it's similar enough in its axiological structure that it fits our problems, but it's different enough that it is free from our history. Okay, now to do all of that, I've got to teach you what cognitive science is and how you do it. So some of you might know this if you've done Cognitive 250 with me, so you'll have to sit through it again. But now I want to shift gears. We're shifting out of the historical mode, we're now shifting into the scientific mode, and I want to start talking and teaching to you what cognitive science is, why it's important. I remind you, though, that this is not completely disconnected from what we've been discussing, because I have shown you repeatedly throughout how the history of the meaning crisis was also the history of the emergence of science, and especially important issues about cognition and cognitive science. Remember, the contemporary of Descartes is Hobbes, who's proposing a cognitive scientific theory that cognition is computation and that artificial intelligence is possible. Okay? But what is cognitive science, and why would you do it? Well, cognitive science was born of the recognition that this term does not have a simple singular referent. When we say mind. So when we say mind, we're actually talking about many different things, and we're doing it often in a very uncoordinated, almost incoherent fashion. One of the things we might be talking about is the brain and how it operates. Many people will often use the word brain and mind as if they're synonyms that are interchangeable. That's something that should perhaps be at least subject to a philosophical question. But one thing you can mean by mind is the brain, and how it functions. And we have a science for that, namely neuroscience. But you may mean something a little bit more abstract than that. You may not mean the brain in an organic sense. You may be talking about how the brain is an intelligent machine, how it's an information processing machine. So you may be talking about it, right? You may be talking about it at the level of an information processing machine. And that would be a level at which you would be able to talk not only about brains, but potentially artificial intelligences, computers, maybe neural nets, etc. And of course, this is studied by AI, artificial intelligence, right, machine learning, which are themselves branches of computer science in some extended fashion. So you could be talking about, when you mean mind, you may mean something like that. And people will even use this kind of, and we talked about it briefly, the idea that the brain is the hardware and the mind, in this sense of the information processing, right, is the software. Right? But of course, you may be talking not about brain or information processing. You may be talking about behavior. Like that, when I'm talking about somebody's mind, I'm talking about the kind of behavior they engage in, right? And of course, if you're trying to understand that, then of course, you're talking about psychology.
As in behaviorism?
No, not as in behaviorism. Behaviorism was a particular thesis that you could only explain behavior using purely behavioral terms. Most of psychology is a form of cognitive psychology born out of the cognitive revolution, in which you explain behavior by making reference to things other than behavior. Typically and most centrally, which is very valuable for this course, the meaning of the stimulus as opposed to its physical properties. Okay, you may be talking about that, but you may be even talking about a particular form of behavior that seems to link minds together and make a lot of mental life possible. This weird thing I'm doing now, where I'm constantly exhaling and making things in my throat vibrate, and then really altering the sound that's coming out of my face hole, and we call it language. Okay? In all of its forms, you may be talking about that. And it's been a huge philosophical project of the 20th century to try and understand the mind, right, in terms of language. That the way we understand and figure out how the mind works is by paying attention to language. And of course, this is linguistics. But you may mean something else by mind, which is also legitimate. You may mean the way in which brains are networked together to run culture. Long before computers were networked together to run the internet, brains were networked together to run cultures. Culture is one of the ways in which our cognition is distinctively different from other organisms on the planet. So when you say mind, you can mean any or all of those. Now, what became increasingly clear is that these disciplines, right, have different languages, different methodologies, different ways of gathering, assessing, and evaluating evidence, different ways of putting theories into competition, etc. So they have tended to have a history of operating in isolation from each other because of these specific differences. However, right, it is very implausible that these levels operate independently from each other. It's very plausible that they are causally impacting and influencing each other in very complex ways. So it is very unlikely that the information processing going on is not causally interacting with your brain or causally interacting with your behavior. So although the disciplines are in isolation, or have been, it is very implausible that the levels that they are studying are causally isolated from each other. In fact, it's much more plausible that they are interacting in very complex and powerful ways. So what was needed was a discipline that wanted to try to capture this missing fact or facts about the interaction between the levels. So while each discipline talked about its level, there wasn't a discipline that made its main concern to talk about the interaction between the levels. But that's basically the mandate of cognitive science. Cognitive science is about trying to come up with an account of how these levels interact. The ideal would be an account about how all of the levels interact in all the multifarious ways they probably interact. But even getting, right, an account of how some of the levels interact, which is considered a significant goal within cognitive science. But that means cognitive science faces tremendous difficulty that the individual disciplines don't face. Each one of these disciplines, right, can stay sort of self-enclosed within its particular vocabulary and methodology. Cognitive science can't do that. So one of the things practically that means is you've got to get quite an education in each one of these disciplines if you're going to practice as a cognitive scientist. So I went to university for 17 years. Yes. Okay, and that doesn't mean I consider myself an expert or anything. I'm just telling you that's the kind of thing it demands from you.
Did they give you a discount?
Pardon me?
Did they give you a discount?
Well, see, I lived at a time in which the culture still acted according to the things it claimed. I mean, I followed the baby, well, I mean, about the way it claims about education. We hear constant claims about how important education is, while we have been defunding education radically and consistently for the past 30 years, right? And simple fact, 30% more of you, 30% less of faculty. Boom. What's the explanation for that? Not proper funding. Okay, so anyways, what I mean is, I was following the baby boomers, and following the baby boomers is like following locusts. They consume everything and then move on, right? But I was close enough to them that I would get the breadcrumbs. So there was enough scholarship and tuition was still low enough that I was able to go through without having debt, which you couldn't do now. So, yeah. Yes?
Does philosophy fit in somewhere? And all
Well, yes. philosophy has a very important role. Because the role of philosophy is to do what philosophy has often centrally seen itself as doing, which is to bridge between disparate discourses, to try and break isolated conceptual vocabularies and to try and create integrative vocabularies, to try and put these various disciplines into argumentative and theoretical relations with each other. So philosophy has often always been about conceptual innovation and creating new conceptual grammars, new theoretical landscapes, about trying to bridge between things that have been divided, disparate discourses. And so philosophy plays a very central role in cognitive science. Not the way a lot of people who don't understand philosophy have been criticizing it in the media, like Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson, who shouldn't speak of things of which they do not know. Right? Philosophy has been and has always been an attempt to try and afford, right, an integration to counteract a fragmentation in our intellectual appropriation of ourselves and reality. Now that's the sort of what philosophy has become in the West, right? Now, we'll talk a little bit later in the course about what we've lost, and we're only regaining the other sense of philosophy, the sense of philosophy as the cultivation of wisdom. But what philosophy is designed to do is, right, to break straitjackets on our thinking, on our theorizing, on our vocabularies, on our theoretical grammars, so that it is possible to get these disciplines to insightfully interact with each other, so that we could get some theoretical, conceptual, and methodological structures for studying the causal interactions between these levels. That's what cognitive science is endeavoring to do. So philosophy is not there sort of trying to offer theories ahead of the time, or because that's what people seem to think philosophy is. Philosophy is theorizing before you can do science or something like that. Philosophy has an ongoing role even as these individual disciplines generate theories, and even as cognitive science as a whole generates theories. So, cognitive science is this discipline that is trying to bring about, right, an integration between these various disciplines, as a way of capturing the very plausible assumption that the levels in each discipline are describing are causally interacting and influencing each other. So, there's three different visions, I would argue, or types of visions, about how you go about doing cognitive science. And there is a talk on the web on this. I delivered at a UTism talk back in 2010. Three visions on the nature of cognitive science. So there's a more extended version of this argument. But basically what I want to do is try to present with you sort of three types, three ways in which people understand what is meant by cognitive science and how you practice it. And then I want to try and argue that one of these three ways is the strongest and best way. So the weakest vision of cognitive science is what I call generic nominalism, which goes, you remember that from Occam. This is the idea that cognitive science is just a generic term for all of these disciplines as a set. There's nothing that holds them together other than our naming of them, right? So the idea here is, when I say cognitive science, I'm not talking about anything other than this set of disciplines. So very often, in fact, people who think this way will not use the term cognitive science. they will use the term the cognitive sciences. So there is nothing that you do to do cognitive science. There is nothing you practice. You're not trying to in any way bring about integration or relation between the disciplines. This is just the name for the set of disciplines that study cognition in a scientific manner. So in that sense, nobody is specifically a cognitive scientist, and anybody in any one of these disciplines counts as a cognitive scientist just in virtue of fact that they belong to one of the disciplines. So there's no difference from somebody being a neuroscientist and then being a cognitive scientist, and then being a psychologist and then being a cognitive scientist. I should point out that although I will present these three visions to you as if they are clear from each other, and I think analytically they are clear, very often they are confused and conflated together in both the current culture and I would even say to a significant degree in the academic community. So, why do I reject that? Why would I argue, I should say? You don't care if I reject it. Why would one reject this? What's my argument for that? I think that this is actually a very implausible and inadequate approach, not because it's in a sense wrong, but because it fails to capture the very thing that needs to be captured, namely the fact that the levels interact and therefore the disciplines should also do so. There should be individuals who are dedicated to trying to understand and facilitate the interaction between the disciplines, not simply practice one of the disciplines. So this, I would argue, is too weak of a position. A stronger position says, well, the disciplines should interact. So I call this interdisciplinary eclecticism. Academics are very, and I'm an academic in some sense, academics are very good at coming on multisyllabic things that don't have that much value. Interdisciplinary eclecticism is the idea that the disciplines should interact sort of periodically and in an eclectic manner. You know, a psychologist should maybe just take some interesting idea from AI, right? Or linguistics should take some interesting idea from, you know, perhaps neuroscience, etc. That's what eclecticism means. Just take a little bit from here, take a little bit from there, in an interdisciplinary fashion. And the main idea here is that the disciplines are not going to be largely impacted by this interaction. It's just some, you know, some useful insights will be transferred here and there. And so the analogy I use to explain this is supposed to be kind of like what happens in interfaith dialogue. So in interfaith dialogue, the idea is, you know, you get people from different faiths together, you know, Buddhists and Jews and Christians and Muslims, etc., right? And they talk, and they're supposed to, you know, share some insights with each other, but there's no sense in which any one of the religions is going to be radically transformed or informed by its interaction with the others, nor is the sense that we're going to create, you know, some overarching integrative method or system. The idea is the disciplines at their core will be left alone, they won't be challenged, they won't be threatened, they won't be informed or transformed. Stuff around the edges will be, modified, and mutual respect will be afforded. Now, I'm not criticizing that project in interfaith dialogue, is just getting people to live together without killing each other is a laudable goal. I get that. But what I'm saying is, as an analogy for cognitive science, it's inadequate. Because it's, again, on the assumption that, right, I don't want to have any deep, insightful integration, anything that in which one discipline will transform another, which doesn't capture the history that's been happening. So, for example, ideas about computation had a huge and dramatic impact on psychology in the cognitive revolution. Just to give an example, ideas of linguistics Chomsky in linguistics, had a huge impact on anthropology, psychology, and perhaps even aspects of artificial intelligence. So pretending that they don't have the capacity to inform and transform each other is disingenuous for one reason. Secondly, it's highly plausible that the causal interactions within, right, between all of these levels are very significant and important and ongoing, and therefore, right, not sufficiently captured by interdisciplinary eclecticism. In fact, what I argue is that this position, right, is inherently unstable. Either what happens is you acknowledge, right, those 2 points, that the disciplines have the capacity to deeply inform and transform each other, and the levels have the ongoing function of deeply affecting each other, in which case you need something stronger than this, or you dig in and you say, no, there's never going to be a very significant insight or transfer, in which case you degenerate back down to this. So this is unstable. It either degenerates down into this, or it needs to go up into a stronger vision, which I would call synoptic integration. Synoptic integration is the idea that I presented, that the goal of cognitive science, synoptic means overlooking it all, and integration is to integrate it. The goal of cognitive science is to try and afford, right, as I said, a conceptual vocabulary, a theoretical grammar that can facilitate, help us to understand, and help us even improve the interaction and the insightful mutual information and transformation of these disciplines in a way that helps to capture how these levels are functioning, right, to causally impact each other in a powerful manner. So that's why I would argue that this is actually the best vision of cognitive science, and that that's what cognitive science is trying to do. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but to foreshadow what's going to be coming down the road, I'm going to argue that because of its nature and function, cognitive science is probably one of the best disciplines for trying to address the meaning crisis, precisely because of its synoptic integration of these various disciplines. So again, it's not going to be any coincidence that the meaning crisis is going to be intersecting with cognitive science, precisely because the meaning crisis is that kind of a pervasive phenomena that it's going to need this vision in order to appropriately frame it and address it. So, how do you go about doing synoptic integration? Like, what do you do to do that? It sounds cool. It's got lots of syllables and stuff. What do you do? Like, what do you do? Like, you want to spend an afternoon doing cognitive science. What do you do? Okay. Well, it's interesting. I mean, what you try to do, right? What kind of moves you're trying to make. Let's talk about this idea of integration, trying to afford insightful transfer between the disciplines. Right? So what does that look like? What happens in insightful transfer? So some of you know, some of you have taken the course with me, Psych 370, in which we talked a lot about issues of insight and transfer. But I'm going to try and use something a little bit more directly accessible that's pervasive throughout our language, where we try to bridge between disparate elements of discourse in order to provoke insight, in order to transform and inform through such integration. And that's something that is pervasive. In fact, you will not speak 2 sentences without having engaged in it, and that's metaphor. I'm also doing this because I spent a lot of my early career in the 90s working on metaphor, and I have to justify that time. Okay? And of course, this is also helpful because we're going to need to talk about metaphor throughout the course. We've already introduced a powerful metaphor that is functioning, 2 metaphors that are functioning in the course. One is the use of the term meaning as a metaphor for something, and of course the zombie zeitgeist as an extended cultural metaphor for the meaning crisis. Now, metaphor, the word metaphor is itself a metaphor. It comes from two Greek words, metapheroi, which means to carry across. You carry, it's about transfer. Right? Now, metaphor is a very interesting thing that we do. And try to follow me as I try to point out to you things that you need to grasp in order to understand the point I'm trying to make. Perhaps you can see what I'm saying, but you can't fully comprehend it yet, because I'm only halfway through the lecture, and this part might be hard. See the point I'm making? Try to say anything without invoking metaphor. Also, just to foreshadow something ahead, even though I'm critical of the specific theory in Lakoff and Johnson, I think they point out a very important phenomenon. Notice how embodied your cognition is, that you're always using terms for your causal interaction with the world for trying to explain how your mind is working. You're expressing and explaining your mind by relying on metaphors for how you're actually physically interacting and coping with your environment. This is part of what it means to say that cognition is embodied. Your bodily interaction with the world is informing and making possible your cognitive grasp, which is itself a metaphor, of the world. Okay? And the idea is, right, metaphors are pervasive throughout our cognition, because what the brain is constantly trying to do is bring about these kinds of insightful integrations by transferring from one domain to another. Right? So we have, and what we do is we have not only metaphors, we have sort of constellations of metaphors. Right? So we have lots of ideas about things being journeys, and relationships are journeys. So, you know, they're just starting out on their relationship. Right? Or they've hit a rough patch, or the relationship is on the rocks. Right? We're understanding it that way. Right? Now, the pervasiveness and the power of this is such that I would challenge you to say anything that you really care about without using a metaphor. You want to try?
Or what about the word love? Is that a metaphor?
Well, that's not a claim, that's a word.
I love X.
I love X.
I love this table.
Pardon me?
I love the table. I love
I
this
love
cup.
the table, that's fine. Okay, now, but I said like if you had to explain it, or give me your understanding of it. So what is it to love somebody?
I'm not sure how to put it into words.
Okay, well, I don't, then we're sort of at an impasse, which is, by the way, a metaphor. So we'll say things like you want to be close to the person, which is, you know, largely metaphorical. I mean, there's a physical truth to it too. I don't deny that. But we talk about falling in love, which is a weird metaphor. In fact, right? It's a very weird metaphor. And it's part of the way in which we sort of understand the processes. We lose agency, right? And we go into something that now surrounds us. It's a very odd idea. Yes?
Is understand itself a metaphor?
Yeah,
Stand
understanding.
under.
Well, it's for us. It's become under to stand under. It was originally Unterstand, which was to stand within.
Oh, okay.
Right? So, what's going on in metaphor? Okay. So, let's say that Sam is a human being, and I say to you, Sam is a pig. Okay? So Sam is a human being, and I say to you, Sam is a pig. Now, what does that mean? Any of you? What does it mean? You've all said something like this at some point in your life. I know you have. So I presume, I mean, I'm not going to super Socrates you here, right? You had some, like, you knew to some degree what you were doing. Like, for example, how many of you think you're praising Sam? Okay, so you know you're doing something other than praising Sam. What might you be trying to convey about Sam? Yes?
It could be a couple of things, like you can say Sam eats a lot, or other things like Sam's overweight.
So it could be that Sam is gluttonous. It could be for food or for sex or for possessions, right? It could be that Sam is messy, and those two could be together. He could be messily gluttonous, or, you know, I don't want to get too graphic about Sam, right? Now, it's a very odd thing, because why say this rather than just saying, you know, Sam is gluttonous, or Sam, you know, overvalues sex, or something like that? Why? Why do that?
Has like more of an impact, perhaps?
Okay, so why? That's a good point. So I don't want to say that's wrong, but push on it. Like, why does it have more of an impact? Why does saying something initially indirectly have more of an impact than just saying it directly? You're right. I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I'm trying to draw you out.
I think more implications, like there's many things that they imply.
Right. So there's somehow a whole set of things associated with pig. But not everything about pigs is getting transferred. This isn't a way of saying to you that Sam lives on a farm, has pink skin, and expects to be eaten someday by other human beings. Okay, so it doesn't convey any of those things. Okay, so somebody else wants to say something. Yes, Rachel?
People refer to people as animals, it seems to be like dehumanizing them in the same
Right.
way that they refer to them as rats, to try to like take away their value as people.
Okay, so what Rachel's pointing out is another facet of a metaphor that isn't in, if I just say Sam is gluttonous. There's an important difference that has to be kept between, right, Sam and pig. Namely, Sam is supposed to be a person, and a pig is supposed to be a non-human animal. And that difference also matters to the meaning of the metaphor. Part of its shock value is that difference. If you go up to a pig and say, "You're such a pig," like, people will look at you. It's kind of a weird thing to do, right? Yes?
Can we say that this is more effective because it establishes Sam as a referent?
Because it establishes
Sam as a referent.
a reference in what way?
I mean, we're referring to something else here, so we're establishing a relationship between two.
Yes, we are. And what I'm trying to get you to see is exactly the nature of this relationship. It's kind of, there's two aspects. There's duality to a metaphor. There's a way in which, right, Sam and the pig are identical. And what you do is you basically take some of the ways in which you frame, right? Remember we talked about framing like in the 9-dot problem? Some of the ways in which you construe, not just an individual claim or this claim or that, but the way in which you construe a pig, and you transfer it to Sam, so that you, if you'll permit me the metaphor we used earlier, I put on my, this is going to be a weird sentence, so please bear with me. I'm going to put on my pig glasses, and I look through my pig glasses and I see Sam in a certain way, and so many different features of Sam become very salient that weren't so salient before. And many other things fade into the background because they're not seen as well. But I remember the whole time that I'm wearing my pig glasses, and Sam shouldn't look that way because Sam isn't a pig. Was that okay? Did that work? Okay. So I got a difference, an identity, and a transfer of construal, all working together in a way that doesn't happen in, like, when you just make a straight claim, like Sam is gluttonous. Okay? You've got an important difference, an important identity, and you've got a transfer of construal. So that you're really altering what you're seeing as salient or important about Sam. It's a very complex and sophisticated process. And what it allows you to do is take one area and do an insightful, you're provoking an insight. It's causing you to reconstrue how you see Sam, re-understand him, reframe him. Is this okay so far? You're doing this all the time. Your language is filled with metaphors, as if language was a container that could be filled. Right? I won't continue to do this for the rest of the lectures, but point out to you all the metaphors found within our language. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make, though, is how complex a process this is. Now notice that this carries a lot of what we're looking for. You may say, what are you talking about, John? I'm like, why are you doing this? What does this have to do with this? Look, metaphors do this in some way, what we talked over here. They create new ways of talking, new languages, new concepts, right? They create new connections. They afford insightful integration. What I need if I'm going to do this is I need to remember the differences between the disciplines, but I also need to find the identities. I need to be able to take something in neuroscience, how neuroscience construes things, and take it into psychology and look at things differently in psychology because of that. Now, I am not saying, please be patient with me. I'm not saying that cognitive science is poetry, it's about creating metaphor. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm trying to get, I'm using metaphor as a way of trying to highlight a concept that I'm now going to talk about. I'm not saying that cognitive science is about making metaphors. I'm talking that cognitive science is trying to do something very similar to this. Okay, why? Because getting these things to all work together is very tricky. If I make the identity relation too great, how many of you think that's a beautiful metaphor? Bees are hornets. Many of you just go like, that's not even a metaphor. That's just sort of false. Because what's happened is the identity has strangled off the difference, and so no reconstrual can happen. The identity has strangled off the difference, so no reconstrual. What if I make the difference, right, to make the difference really great, and the identity very abstract and obscure? Arguments are chairs. Well, they're both human-made, they both have supporting structures. Crappy metaphor. Because now the differences, right, are so great that you don't have enough guidance on how to do the reconstrual. The transfer becomes too, right, weak. It doesn't provoke insight. So the term, this is what I've been building towards, the term that's used when people are doing the cognitive science metaphor is what we're looking for in a metaphor is its aptness. By the way, which is something that you've picked up a little bit in the Varela book about aptness and how you're coping with things. A metaphor has to be apt. Okay? What it needs to do, right, is insightfully bridge and afford, right, the reconstrual by getting the right balance between identity and difference. Is that okay so far? Now, what's very interesting is that this idea of act transfer is actually central to understanding what's going on in science, according to some very important argument by Philip Kitchett, where he's talking about integration or explanatory unification. How one of the main functions of science is to bring about an integration of areas that were not previously integrated. The very thing we're talking about here. Now, what he talks about is how does this work? He says, well, what happens is you have a particular construct. The construct is a way of construing things, a way of finding problems, formulating those problems, framing how you're going to, what you're going to pay attention to, what you're going to look at, how you're going to look at. And then what you do is you can transfer that construct to many different domains that were previously disparate. And it allows you to find and formulate problems in those, and solve problems in those many different domains. So here's an example. Force equals mass times acceleration. Okay? That integrates what they previously disparate areas. You see, for us, again, we're post-Newtonian, so we see everything through this construal. But we forget that that was an achievement. Right? Before Newton, there was no radical connection between the apocryphal, or at least proverbial, apple falling, planets traveling around, right, the sun, how whales are buoyant in the ocean, right? What happens to you in a car accident? Like, those are all disconnected events. But after Newton, they're not. They're integrated because he comes up with a construct that will transfer. You can go to each one of those domains, find, formulate, and solve problems in each one of those domains. They get integrated together. Because what he has is he has a multi-opt construct. In a metaphor, you have, right, it's just a one-way aptness. Sam is a pig, right? Just one. This is apt in many, right, different ways. He's got this, like, this is part of what, there's a genius to this, right? He had to get this pitched at just the right level that he could, right, pick out the identities without, right, squashing the differences, so that you could go to these different domains and apply the same thing. So this is multi-aptness. One of the ways in which we integrate across disparate discourses, right, is we come up with a construct that is multi-apt. This is an example of that. There are many examples of them, okay? One example in cognitive science was the idea from Hobbes that cognition is computation. Because that allowed us to try and look at the brain in one way, to look for certain kinds of logical processing happening in the brain, to look at the software, the mind, right, the information processing being something what's going on here. Psychology, it allowed the cognitive revolution. It allowed you to talk about what's going on inside people's heads, the way you could talk about rigorously what's going on inside a computer. Language, well, that maybe, language, spoken language is something like what computer languages are. Culture, maybe the way computers are networked together is the same way brains are networked together in culture. That's the same kind of multi-apt construct. You come up with something that transfers to each one of these disciplines and finds, formulates, and frames, allows us to construe them in an insightful and powerful manner. That's doing cognitive science. I would argue, this is not an argument that Kitcher makes, this is an argument that I've made elsewhere. I think that this is what scientists are talking about when they're talking about how elegant something is. Right? They often use the word simple and then they invoke Occam, and we've already seen that that's a mistake and a disaster. Right? I think this is what they mean by elegance. They mean this kind of multi-aptness. The idea that cognition is computation is an elegant idea. It affords integration across these disciplines and gives us ways of researching how these levels might be represented as interacting with each other. However, that's not the only thing you want to do, right? You don't just want that, because whenever you're projecting forward like this, you're making a claim about how much sense something makes, how much sense it's going to make. And that enmeshes you and a particular kind of normativity, right? This is where you're invoking, and we have lots of synonyms. Well, that stands to reason, or that makes good sense. Listen to the word making sense, where it didn't exist before, right? But what we're invoking there is we're actually invoking plausibility. Plausibility is when we judge something that should be taken seriously, that it makes good sense, that it seems to be promoting in new intelligibility, new understanding. But of course, plausibility isn't just this. Plausibility has a sense of rigorousness to it. And where's that rigor that's coming from? Well, if you look at work that Frank Kyle did in 2006 and other people on how human beings generate explanations, one of the things human beings like is they like this. They like it when they can find an elegant construct, when one thing can do this kind of transferring to many different domains and integrating them. But human beings also like this. Right? So when I took Spencer to see Up, which is a 3D movie, the first one he'd gone to see, I was going again for the second time because I'd been to the older version of it with the cardboard blue and red lenses, which made you nauseous and hate yourself and stuff like that. And so I wanted to take him to see Up because, well, I heard it's a great movie. It does turn out to be a great movie. The metaphors are pretty obvious, like banging his house behind him and all that stuff. It's still good, right? But also I wanted to see how people process the 3D. And so like midway through the movie, I took my glasses off to see what, not these, the 3D glasses, that would have been useless to take my glasses, to see what people were doing. It was kind of like an anthropological interest. And a lot of the kids were doing this. They're doing this. And what was disturbing is several of the adults were as well. Okay, now, why were the kids doing this? The kids are doing this because, right, there's a chance that if you can only see it and not touch it, then it's not what? Notice the word you want to use there, automatically, real. Because if I can touch it and see it, then it's more likely that it's real. Why? What's behind that? Well, this is what's behind that, right? If I'm just seeing, there's a chance that my seeing is due to subjective bias and projection. But it's unlikely that both my seeing and my touch are both due to that. So what I can do is I can, what Nicholas Rescher calls, this kind of convergence, right, creates what he calls trustworthiness. Trustworthiness isn't truth. Trustworthiness is your confidence that, right, that your conclusion is not due to bias. So the more convergence you have, the more you have independent things converging on the same thing, right, the more trustworthy your construct is. Because there's less and less a chance that it's been produced by subjective bias. That's why we like numbers in science. Have you ever wondered why? I mean, we have the historical reasons that Galileo gave about math, but what's the actual, is there epistemological reason why we like numbers? Well, here's why. Numbers afford convergence. Look, you can see 3. You can touch 3. You can hear 3. Numbers allow us to increase the trustworthiness of our construct by affording convergence between independent sense information, independent inquirers, independent investigators. They afford a massive expansion of convergence, and convergence increases trustworthiness. That's why. Now it struck me, and some of the people I'm working with, based on some work done by Elijah Milgram, book called Practical Induction and some other articles he's written, that these actually belong together. That what we most want is this. We want a lot of convergence onto a construct that turns out to be very elegant, to give us a lot of multi-actness. We want a lot of trustworthiness integrated with a lot of power. In fact, what Milgram argued is we want a balance between these. The more we want to extend our construct to find new problems and to formulate them and solve them, the more we want that construct to be the result of a convergent process of independent investigation. So, convergence and elegance have to be balanced together. That's why we have words for when plausibility is failing in different ways. So, for example, if you have a lot of convergence onto something that has very little elegance, that doesn't make it false. It gets rejected because, and this is a word, you'll find it on almost every scientific article when a position is being criticized, that's when something is trivial. We don't doubt that it's true. In fact, we regard it as largely trustworthy, but it's not doing any elegant work for us. It has no multi-actness. It's not finding and formulating new problems. It's not giving us a new understanding of anything. One of the ways in which you can bullshit people is to say something trivial that sounds like you're saying something insightful. Everything comes to an end. And what does, tell me, like, yes. Okay. What problems have now been formulated differently? What's been solved? It hasn't been solved. Like, it's pretty trivial. If you say, lots of things we thought were unchanging turn out to change, well, that's interesting. But the first is trivial because all you have to come up with is the right description, and of course everything is changing. Even eternal things like 2 + 2 = 4 are changing because one, I thought about it on Tuesday, and then I didn't think about it. Like, you just do all kinds of crap like that. Okay? So, often, right, one of the things you can in fact do is you can say something that at a surface level is trivially true, and then at a deeper level is actually false, but it sounds profound. Okay? The philosopher Daniel Dennett calls that calls it a deepening. It's a form of being. So people will say things like, this is one of my favorite, love is only a 4-letter word. And it's like, and you go, oh, right. What? Well, at the superficial level, that's true. This thing here is only a 4-letter word. And that's pretty trivial, right? Because does that give you any insight into your relationships and why they never work? No. And at the deeper level that you care about it, the thing that it refers to, that thing isn't a 4-letter word. But you wait, oh, yeah. Okay? So triviality, right, is something that, right, it's a way in which we reject an idea, not because it's false, because it doesn't deserve to be taken seriously. But there's the opposite, right?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Sorry, so this like triviality, for example, in statistical terms, would be something that has a okay p-value, but really small effect size, I guess.
Possibly. I don't know if I want to quantify it quite that way. You mean so it has very low power but it has some sort of statistical significance.
Yeah.
I think that's a species of it, but I don't know if I would be confident saying that every instance where we're talking about that is that, because I'm not sure that, that hypotheses and things like that belong to populations in quite the same way. I'm just not sure about applying it as generally as you want to. I would count it as an instance of what I'm talking about. I don't know if it's an identity claim. What about this? Where I have this idea, this construal that will but okay, we have a term for that, and it's great because it even captures it metaphorically. We call this far-fetched. Far-fetched. Most conspiracy theories aren't taken seriously precisely because they're far-fetched. We pay a price for that. Some of them must be true, or possibly, but I just make it a policy that I will not listen to conspiracy theories. If you just believe that the English royal family are lizard beings from space, you can explain a lot of European history. And you can. You can. But you know what? I'm just not going to take it up because I don't find the construct very trustworthy. Now, we want a balance. If it doesn't have that much going forward, we don't demand that much coming up to it. Like if you say, I like vanilla ice cream. We don't demand a lot from people behind that. Because it's not going to reach out into the world and find and formulate problems, integrate. You're not doing a lot of epistemic work with I like ice cream. So you know what? We don't take, doesn't have to, no, I don't believe you. You've got to do a lot of investigation to come up with that you like ice cream. Right? But there are instances where we have a lot of convergence coming into a lot of elegance. We have something that's highly plausible. And I think we have a word for that, and that's when we would regard some idea or construct as profound. And profound means it's really worthy of being taken very seriously because of this. Okay, so what cognitive science is trying to do is to, come up with plausible constructs. The one I just gave you not that long ago, like cognition's computation, that will integrate across the disciplines, facilitate, reconstrual, information, and mutual transformation. Like trying to come up with profound constructs for doing that. Cognitive science is trying to bring about, constructs like cognitionist computation that have many different things feeding into them. We saw all the different lines of inquiry that led Descartes to that idea. And then I showed you how that idea was being taken into all of the different levels to try and explain and understand problems and issues. That's why it was a profound idea. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's profound. Because what it does is it sets up integrated discourse, integrated investigation, integrated theorizing between the disciplines. And it gets us on the path to capturing the causal interaction between these levels in a fruitful and ongoing manner. And we've been doing it since the 1950s in the cognitive revolution, following that highly profound construct, the cognitionist computation. Yes?
Is plausibility for convergence alone, or is plausibility time?
No, this is plausibility.
Oh, convergence plus elegance?
Convergence and elegance balanced together.
So plausibility is almost not to profoundness.
Yes, these are both plausible because you have a balance between convergence and,
Oh, a balance.
Right.
I see.
but this
That's
is
what
profound. Pardon me?
Magnitude. So the other one has a higher magnitude.
Exactly, exactly, that's exactly right. So they both have balance, so they're both plausible. This is profound because not only does it have balance, but as you say, it has magnitude. It has a lot of convergence and a lot of elegance. Yes?
Isn't something trivial also plausible?
No, because something is trivial, right? If it has a lot of convergence, but very little, there's an imbalance.
So maybe I'm misunderstanding plausibility that has to do with whether it's true or not?
So there's two senses of plausible, and I'm trying to pull them apart, right? One meaning, and Rasher talks about, one meaning of plausible is just as a synonym for highly probable, and in that sense, trivialities are plausible. But there's also plausible, which means it makes sense, right? It's doing something, it's like it's really affording our understanding of things. And one of the reasons why we reject trivial things is because they're not really affording our understanding. They're truths, in a sense, that don't generate much understanding. So in that second sense of plausibility, they're not plausible. Okay? So that's the sense I'm trying to emphasize here. Yes?
Does this get at the machinery that characterized the Socrates and what Socrates rejected?
Because they were manipulating plausibility by fooling around with convergence and elegance? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes.
Oh, that's good. I hadn't thought of that. We should write a paper on that.
And then how that often salience.
Well, what I can do, right? Yeah, is I could. No, I'm sorry. I'm excited about your idea. I'm stealing it from you. I didn't mean to do that. But I could make like if I got a really far-fetched thing, I could make the elegance really salient and keep you from paying much attention to the lack of convergence. That's good. And you know, not to steal from you, because you have your moment of growth. Glory unto you. Okay, you have your moment, but I mean that's part of I think what Dennett's trying to get at with this. You kind of have this salience equivocation going on that gets you to not notice the BS. And in a similar way, yeah, you could make the elegance really super salient. And yeah.
It's also like Donald Trump's comment on stopping its independence.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
It skews your attention away from certain things.
Yeah. Always promise and never examine. That's Donald Trump, right? Very good. I hadn't thought about that. He really is far-fetched. Thank you.
No problem.
That's insightful. Okay, I've got a little bit more work to do. Is that okay? So part of what you're doing in cognitive science is you're trying philosophically, that's where philosophy comes in, by making use of your understanding of problems and phenomena within each one of these disciplines, right? You're trying to create profound constructs that will afford a synoptic integration between the disciplines. Is that okay? So cognitive science is very demanding. Right? Because in the other disciplines, you'll have a lot of established stuff that you can just work with. In cognitive science, you're trying to create the established stuff that the interdisciplinary dialogue can work with, which makes it thrilling and frustrating. Yes?
To what degree does profundity rely on a universal convergence and universal elegance? Different things are profound to different people.
Yes. So yes, I mean, and this is a comprehensive issue about just how theories are in general and about the issue of understanding. So we're not so much interested in personal or subjective profundity, although we might be able to make use of this idea when we talk about experiences that individuals find profound, because I would suggest that they do this for individuals in some fashion. People get a sense of all of their past has come somehow to this moment, and this moment is opening up the future for them, and they get this sort of structure going on, and I think it would help us to understand personal profundity. But what I'm talking about in cognitive science is a move towards a generalized profundity, one that can be shared across theorists, shared across observers, etc.
So as universal as.
Yeah, as possible. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, but there's one more thing, because what's guiding all of this in cognitive science? And again, this will take us right back into the meaning crisis. Okay? Why is cognitive, So this is what cognitive science is trying to do, but why bring about, I mean, you should bring about this integration because it reflects a deep truth, but is there any sort of guiding purpose to it? Well, here's the thing. What cognitive science is trying to do that these individual disciplines really don't address is a problem we've seen in this course already. We have a scientific explanation of a lot of things. You know what we don't have a scientific explanation of? How we generate scientific explanations. We have a scientific worldview in which we do not belong. There is a hole at the center of our scientific worldview. We aren't in it, even though we generate it. We don't belong in the scientific worldview that we create to explain everything else, because we don't have an explanation of the mind, cognition, that properly situates us back into the scientific worldview. The way Descartes separated us from it so very long ago. There's a hole. And as long as that hole exists, we fundamentally don't belong. So the hope is, right, the sort of noble endeavor above and beyond trying to reveal how these levels interact is perhaps this synoptic integration, if it is profound enough, will allow us to give a scientific, naturalistic explanation of cognition, of how we make meaning, how we make intelligibility, of how consciousness arises. All these things that have flung us out of the world that science portrays, perhaps what cognitive science can do is to give us a scientific explanation of the cognition that makes science itself, and makes the people that make science. So this is the naturalistic imperative in cognitive science. To try and, what naturalism doesn't mean like something that, you know, hippies do in 1968. What naturalism means is that you're going to explain the mind ultimately in a way that is integratable, listen to the language, integratable with the natural sciences, especially biology and physics. So you're doing all of this to try and satisfy the naturalistic imperative. You're trying to recapitulate in cognitive science the history of science. Like Thales, you're going to try and analyze cognition into its more basic underlying stuff, like Thales tried to do. Like Descartes, you're going to try and formalize it. You're going to try and come up with a mathematical, ultimately kind of explanation. Why? Because ultimately, if we're going to satisfy the naturalistic imperative, we have to explain the mental in non-mental terms. Because as long as we ultimately explain the mind in terms of mental terms, we are using a language and a vocabulary that does not exist in the natural sciences. That's how Descartes was able to defeat Hobbes. Because the scientific revolution had taken all of that mind stuff out of the world. As long as we're ultimately explaining the mind only in mental terms, we're still over here, trapped behind Descartes' wall. We ultimately have to explain the mental in non-mental terms. Finally, somebody I didn't talk about, but Turing, mechanize. The idea that we could actually create artificial intelligence. And by creating it, we would get a profound understanding of it. That's what cognitive science is trying to do. It is trying to create profound constructs that will bridge between the disciplines, afford a synoptic integration that will satisfy the naturalistic imperative. And that is a project worthy of its own pursuit because of the truth of the relationship between the levels, but it is also directly relevant to this course because the naturalistic imperative runs right into and is interpenetrating with the meaning crisis in Western society. And because cognitive science has taken this task on, it is the place where the meaning crisis and science come together.
Okay, remember when Aristotle criticized Thales because he said, okay, you're generating knowledge, but like, what can I do with that? Like, how do I transcend with this knowledge of underlying substance?
Or you mean Socrates?
Oh, sorry, yeah, Socrates.
Fair enough, yeah?
So here, wouldn't you, like,
Right.
okay, let's say we understand, we are able to naturalize cognition, and then it's like, and then what? Like, so, you know,
Right. So that's what I said earlier. So cognitive science wouldn't be enough on its own to address the meaning crisis, because it's ultimately a knowledge project. You want a wisdom project, a set of psychotechnologies designed to transform cognition and make us wiser and compassionate, but a kind of set of psychotechnologies that could line up with this naturalized view of the mind. You would want perhaps something like Buddhism to be integrated with cognitive science.
So is the goal of the naturalistic imperative so that when we do find like a paradigm for wisdom, it has to be like authentic? Because now that we've like realized science, it's like we're not willing to accept bullshit anymore, right? Is that the idea?
Sometimes.
Or it's like our goal is we don't want to be bullshitted. So is the idea that we're doing this so that we can, when we do find a paradigm for wisdom, like it can be, like we can believe it, like you know
Well,
what I
part of
mean?
it is that we would want any new wisdom psychotechnologies to have a kind of deep scientific legitimacy for us. But it's not only that, I mean, cognitive science has to address sort of the historical problems that have arisen. Buddhism is not designed to do that. It can't answer those intellectual problems that are thwarting us, right? It can provide us with psychotechnologies, but it can also do something else. Although it may not be able to give us the scientific knowledge we need to answer these problems that we've inherited, right? In addition to the psychotechnologies, it may give us access to phenomena that will help improve our scientific endeavors as we try to carry out the naturalistic imperative. So for example, the West has not done a very good job at studying altered states of consciousness. It's very plausible that by studying altered states of consciousness in a highly disciplined manner, you can generate all kinds of phenomena that might go towards better explaining consciousness than if you just take sort of our normal everyday consciousness as containing all the properties of consciousness that need to be explained or accounted for. So, again, we're starting to see why Buddhism and cognitive science. Why Buddhism and cognitive science. So now you've got a good idea of how you go about doing cognitive science. What we'll do after the test is we'll start doing cognitive science. And we're going to create a plausibility argument that will ultimately try and give you a cognitive science of what making these connections really is and why it's so central to cognition. But first, your test. So good luck about that on Wednesday. I'll see you here on Wednesday, okay? Have a good day, guys.